So our next speaker is Lisa Burnapp, Associate Director, Living Donation and Transplant at NHS-BT. Now, Lisa's going to be talking about the UK Living Kidney Sharing Scheme, starting in 2007. Now, as you're going to hear, is now one of the largest kidney exchange programs of its kind. Lisa.
Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be with you. I think the first time I received an invitation to join you at a face-to-face meeting was probably a year ago, if not more. So it's really a great pleasure to have an opportunity actually to talk to you about this scheme, which is, for some patients, may be very well known, and for others actually, and indeed may have benefited from it, and for others actually may be quite hidden. So I just really want to give you an opportunity to hear about this today. So I'm just going to cover a little bit about the past, present and future of the scheme. But what I really want to do is to chat. And I want to chat with you. And of course, I can't do that because you're not in the room with me, but I know you're all out there somewhere. So during the course of this, and you don't have to do it now, but just type into the chat one thing that you'd really like to know about the kidney sharing scheme. Now, it may be that by the time I get to the end of this talk that we've covered it, but if not, and we have time, I will try and answer those questions for you. So let's go back to the beginning and where it all started. And it really started because we all know, and most of you will know, that living donation is a good thing to do for kidney patients because the outcomes are so good. And also it gives opportunity and choice for patients to have the right transplant for them at the right time. And also, of course, contributes to everybody having a transplant because the more donors we have, either living or after death, the more transplants for everybody. And economically, living donation actually really makes sense for the health economy because the longevity of these transplants means that actually more people are transplanted, fewer patients on dialysis. And not only is that better for patients, it's better for everybody. Just bear with me with the technology. I'm just, my screen is going in and out. So I don't seem to be able to move my slides on. Could you move my slide on for me, please? Thank you. So really the scheme started because up to about a third of patients donors who were willing to give to recipients who needed a transplant were unable to do so because they were incompatible either by blood group or by HLA tissue type. So other countries like the Netherlands had started an exchange program, and we were interested in doing the same. I'm going to try and move my slide on, but I'm not connecting. So next slide, please. So the legal framework changed in 2006 and allowed different relationships between living donors and their recipients to exist. So we had, for the first time, we had the opportunity for strangers to donate to people who they'd never met and for people to exchange kidneys outside traditional relationships of family or close friends. And over the years, we've continued to refine and review the scheme. Next slide, please. So in the very beginning, we just had two very basic combinations of transplants. So in April 2007, the very first matching run that we had, and we run them 4 times a year, had just 9 pairs of donors and recipients in, and we identified 1 pair. And we were absolutely delighted about this. A year later, we felt able to extend that into what we call three-way swaps, including 3 pairs in a cycle, each donor donating and each recipient receiving a transplant from the other. Next slide, please. But over the years, our ambitions for living donor transplantation were to increase the number that we did, improve outcomes for recipients, and obviously look after our donors was critically important. But actually in doing that, it was all about creating opportunities. So next slide, please. So the Living Kidney Sharing Scheme really speaks to so many of the ambitions that we had over that decade. More options for patients to have a transplant, more living donors coming into the scheme, just maximising the efficiency and number, and also importantly, making opportunities for people to have a transplant in this country and not having to move overseas for risky, high-risk transplants. And all of this has enabled us to remove some barriers to having a living donor kidney transplant. Next slide, please. So the scheme today looks like this. So every quarter, we identify not only two-way and three-way swaps that we introduced earlier, but now also, and if you could just press my next slide, please. You'll see that these non-directed altruistic donors, people who donate willingly and voluntarily to somebody on the list, are now introduced into this scheme to create a chain of transplants by donating to a paired recipient whose donor then donates to somebody on the waiting list. And in 2012, 2015, we had what we called short with one pair in the middle, and then long chains with two pairs in the middle. And in 2018, because of the success of these transplants, we introduced all those non-directed donors as a default into the scheme, provided that there wasn't a high priority recipient on the waiting list. And what I mean by that is that if one of these kidneys could be the golden ticket for a really long waiting patient or somebody who was really difficult to match, then that non-directed donor would donate to somebody on the waiting list. Next slide, please. So this is what it looks like if you take a graphic of that scheme, and you can see that every quarter we have between 250 and 300 pairs of donors and recipients in our matching runs, which are identified in all these different exchanges. So the technical people who developed this very clever program produce thousands and thousands of combinations of transplants, which are then sorted out into the optimal combination of transplants for everybody. Next slide, please. So just really very quickly, all I wanted to highlight here was our matching algorithm is done by a series of criteria. The top criteria are, of course, we want to maximize the number of transplants, but we also we know that sometimes things happen to patients and they're not able to proceed. So what we do is we very carefully identify in those longer combinations an opportunity to default to a shorter combination, so as many people can still continue to be transplanted if somebody is unable to proceed. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go through all of this in detail, but I just really want to highlight that this scheme runs across all the 4 countries in the UK. There are all sorts of very important criteria that have to be met in order for donors and recipients to go in and ensure that everybody is protected. So all the transplant assessment needs to be up to date and so on. Really importantly, if you're thinking of going into this scheme, is that you need to be aware that if for any reason your circumstances change, that has a chain reaction. And of course, those things can happen. But if you know that there are reasons that things might not work well for you, then maybe you should opt out of a matching run for that particular time. So this is a very important part to get right. It's all about the detail. Next slide, please. So it's a team sport, and it requires central leadership, definitely, and that comes from NHS Blood and Transplant, and there's a whole team of us working on this. I really provide the clinical leadership and talk on behalf of my colleagues here today, who really are backstage doing an awful lot of the really complicated work behind this. But actually also donors and recipients who go into this scheme have a big responsibility, a responsibility to yourselves to consider the option and to others who you're in the scheme with, so that, as I say, as many transplants as possible can proceed. And that's a difficult thing to do. It's a different way of thinking about living donation, because typically it's always been, I will give to the person I love. What this scheme enables you to do is for the person you love or the person you care about to benefit from a transplant while others do too, which to me is a win-win. Next slide, please. But we can do better. We can always do better. So what can we do? Next slide, please. So I've always called this a continuous improvement program. So from 2007, when it first started, right through to the present day, periodically, every 2 to 3 years, we have reviewed the scheme and said, what can we do better and differently to benefit patients? And our priorities have always been about making the pool bigger, because the more donors and recipients we have in the pool, the more transplants we will get out of the pool. Allowing flexibility in the scheme to enable as many transplants to happen as possible. tackling those transplants that fall down at a late stage and really disappoint patients and cause all sorts of distress, and making sure people know about the scheme and how they can access it and who they need to talk to about it. Next slide, please. So increasing the donor pool has been about a number of things. One or two I've touched on. The first thing was increasing the number of non-directed donors that go into the pool. So as a default, as I've already said. Inclusion of compatible pairs. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is if you're a younger person and you have an older donor, so for example, a child with a grandmother who's willing to donate but not a suitable parent, that isn't an ideal age match for a child. But you could go into the scheme and get a younger donor for the child and age match the donor, the older donor, to another recipient in the pool. And this has happened, and it's absolutely joyful. About 10% of our children are now transplanted through the scheme, and about 20% of our adults. And then we talk about desensitization, which is antibody removal. And sometimes we can look at lower risk transplants for really highly sensitized patients, people with lots of antibodies. So this is a really important aspect of the scheme, that we can try and manipulate things a little bit to benefit patients who would otherwise not get a transplant opportunity at all. Next slide, please. So, and the next slide, please, because it'll bring up a box. Thank you. So donating to a stranger has become big news in the UK. Everybody was very sceptical about it in the beginning because the experience in other countries told us that people didn't do this kind of thing. Well, they do in the UK. And the Give a Kidney charity, as you know, have been huge, great proponents of this scheme. And you can see there on the right-hand side in that box that over the years, they have facilitated more than 1,000 transplants. So 847 donors at the end of March this year, and that's increased since, have facilitated 1,177 transplants. So that's really huge. And when they go into a chain, then actually the benefit is increased. So this is a really important part of what we do. They are the game changers, and this is where the magic happens. Next slide, please. Now, I talked about inclusion of compatible pairs, and if you could just give me my next slide, you'll see the difference that this makes. So most people want to donate directly one to the other. Why would you go into a scheme like this if you can give to your husband, your child, whatever? But as I said, sometimes there can be advantages for a better match, either for HLA or age. So if we look at the numbers, and these are taken pre-pandemic, so 112 compatible pairs were included in the scheme from across all the centres. 147 of those exchanges that they were in were completed, and that created 259 transplant opportunities for everybody else. And most of these compatible pairs are in fact transplanted in the scheme within 1 or 2 matching runs. So that's between 3 to 6 months. And then if you don't get a match, you can always come out again. So this is something that we really want to encourage because it benefits the patients themselves, and it also benefits other patients, which again is a win-win. Next slide, please. So the other thing is about increasing flexibility in the scheme. Now, I'm not going to go into all of these in detail, but basically what we do is we have a number of criteria that recipients can request, so age and HLA preferences when you go into the scheme. We have designated timeframes across all centres where we try to achieve all the transplants, because we know that the greater the delay, the more risk there is that transplants won't proceed. We have slightly staggered chains. So even if we identify chains where we would ideally do them all at the same time across all centres in the UK, sometimes that's just not possible logistically. But if you have a very short time frame within maybe a couple of weeks for all those transplants to proceed, then actually that reduces delay and allows the transplants to go ahead safely. And this is facilitated hundreds of transplants by that alone. And then there's always the worry, isn't there, that if you're donating into a scheme like this, well, what if my donor donates and I miss out? Well, we have a system where we can prioritise you for a transplant on the waiting list if that should happen. Now, it doesn't mean it puts you above everybody else, but it does put you above everybody else in your particular bit of the waiting list. And that's been a really important development. Next slide, please. So tackling non-proceeding transplants, what do I mean by this? What I mean by this is when everybody's been matched and everybody knows that they've got who they've been matched with, and then something goes wrong and that transplant or that exchange cannot proceed. And that's hugely devastating. Now, we know that unforeseen things happen to people, and we expect about a quarter of the transplants that are identified that could happen each time. So we aim for 75% of all the identified transplants in the scheme to go ahead. But sometimes that's less than that. And so the real thing we're trying to tackle here is things that you can foresee and things you can't foresee. So we pay a lot of attention to the detail before people go into a matching run, and we will ask you a lot of questions about your circumstances at that time. Are you well? Are you going to be getting married? Are you going on holiday and you can't participate? So if there's any doubt about that, we would say leave you out of that matching run, because this isn't the time for you, but we'll put you back in to the following one. So my mantra is, if in doubt, leave them out. Next slide, please. And we monitor every centre really carefully. Now, I've blanked out the centres here, but actually every 6 months we look at this data, the number of matches by centre, the number of transplants that haven't gone ahead, and why. And then we go back to those centres and we say, is there anything that you could do either with yourselves or with your patients to avoid this happening? So this is a really important part of what we do, and this is done on a survey monkey. Next slide, please. So the really important thing for all of you is, how can we make sure that you know about the scheme, and how can we make sure that you have access to it? So it's doing things like this. It's talking to you about it. It's writing articles about it. It's sharing our learning in it, because it is a learning curve. And it's also about how healthcare professionals, how my colleagues make decisions with you and on behalf of you about the best options for you. Next slide, please. So we've had quite a lot of publicity, because this has caught the attention over the years of the media. So first of all, there are resources on the NHS Blood and Transplant website, either in short animation films or in the leaflet that you can see there, online information. So please do look at it. It gives you chapter and verse about how the scheme works. But the 2-minute little video on the Transplant TV films just gives you that overview and makes, how does it actually work for me? There was a lovely article that became front news in The Guardian of these 3 pairs who were all prepared to meet, because of course this is an anonymous scheme, but sometimes people are willing to meet. And this was a beautiful story. Hit the front cover of the weekend magazine. You couldn't ask for more. And it was just lovely. I enjoyed reading it. It was just fantastic and inspiring. And then, of course, on World Kidney Day and things like that, we've been able to show the number of transplants that have gone through the scheme. And at this point, that was 2 years ago, we'd done our 1,000th transplant in World Kidney Week. So that was really rather nice. Next slide, please. And for professionals, it's quite complicated, this scheme. So we provide monitoring reports for them so they can see how the scheme is progressing and the risks and the benefits of it. We provide calculators so they can sit with you in a clinic room and work out your likelihood of being matched in the scheme. And we provide an annual report in which we have all of the information and the data that they need to support decisions with you. And of course, this is your data too. It's in the public domain. Next slide, please. So what difference has the scheme made? Next slide, please. So over the years, this shows adult living donor kidney transplants. And you can see on the far left of the slide, this shows 10 years. And in fact, if we went back 10 years before, we'd find that actually we were only ever transplanting from people who were blood relatives or emotionally related. So friends, rarely, and more often partners and spouses. And over the years, you can see the complexity of the scheme has changed. And now, and although this is very small, those black blocks are the non-directed donors, are donors who donate to anyone on the list. The grey ones are the ones that receive through the pairs and the pooled, so pairing being 2 couples, pooled being 3. And then you can see that the number of incompatible transplants there in the little squares below in the last block are much less. So the growth and the sustainability in the programme is now largely due to the kidney sharing scheme, and it accounts for about 20% of all our transplants. Next slide, please. So this is the kind of report, and if you just ping the slides on probably about 3 or 4 times, you'll find circles come up, and these are all very small, and I'm not showing it to you because I'm expecting you to look at it. I think that's probably it now. Thank you. But you will see that this is provided for healthcare professionals every quarter, and it depicts the matching runs, the number of transplants that have been achieved overall, the largest size of runs, the trend in terms of the numbers of transplants happening, where they're happening, what kinds of transplants they are, and also the impact we're having on the monitoring of the non-proceeding transplants. Now, COVID was difficult, and I'll show you a bit more about that in a moment, and it's created some challenges. But you can see overall there's a lot happening in this scheme, and there's a lot that's benefiting patients. So it's really something that we're really happy is developing in the way that it is. Next slide, please. So the real impact is patients. So for adults, we've reduced the need for incompatible transplants during the lifetime of this scheme. And you can see the dramatic reduction in the requirement for those really quite complicated transplants, either by removing antibodies against blood group or HLA type. Next slide, please. And the same is true for children. And I think this is less well known. I think typically parents want to give a kidney to their child, but sometimes that's just not possible. And actually this scheme gives them a real opportunity to get their child a really, really good living donor transplant. Next slide, please. One of the really lovely side effect benefits of this scheme is the ability to address health inequalities. And again, this data, I can tell this slide will be very small to you, but what I'm really trying to identify here is that for both adults and children, around 20 to 25% of the recipients of kidneys in this scheme come from Black, Asian, mixed race and ethnic minority groups. And that's really important to us because, as we know, there is a disproportionate disadvantage if you're from those groups. And this is regardless of the ethnicity of the donor. So 99% of our non-directed donors are from a white background, but 20 to 25% of the recipients in this scheme have a transplant facilitated for our BAME communities. So that's a result, I think. Next slide, please. And this is just to illustrate on the infographic on the NHSBT website that slight over-representation of living donor transplants, I hope, part of that has been contributed not only to the initiatives that have been running for those communities, but also to this scheme. Next slide, please. So this is one of those horrible statistical graphs, isn't it? That sort of you think, oh gosh, what does that mean? But what I'm trying to show here is that the survival of these transplants, despite the fact that we move kidneys around the countries between centres, are equivalent to a direct living donor transplant. And that's really what this slide is showing you. And importantly, what it's showing you is that the transplant outcome for these transplants is always better than if you have an HLA incompatible or a blood group incompatible transplant. So a compatible transplant is really what we want to achieve for you if you're waiting for a kidney. And if we can do it through this scheme, then that works for me. So next slide, please. So as Peter alluded to, this has now become the largest and most innovative scheme actually in Europe, amongst 3 others, Spain and the Netherlands. And you can see there the contribution of the scheme in the UK in comparison with those other countries. Next slide, please. So in the last minute, I just want to talk to you a little bit about the future. So we've had a terrible time. You as patients have had a terrible time. So what can we do with this scheme to try and improve the landscape of living donor kidney transplantation for you? Next slide. And next slide, please. So the COVID bomb hit living donation harder than perhaps anything at all, and it has taken longer to recover than deceased donation, there is no doubt. We suspended matching runs out of necessity for safety of donors and recipients. But we are determined now to keep the quarterly matching run going through the next year and manage that so that we don't have these peaks and troughs of activity, and we try and sustain activity through the scheme because it makes such a contribution. Next slide, please. Our greatest opportunity, as many of you will know and have campaigned for, is that living donation and deceased donation sit side by side in the next 10-year vision, the next organ donation and transplantation strategy that is a UK strategy facilitated by NHS Blood and Transplant, actually has these two things in the same sentence. And living donation will be an expected part of care and offered to patients where they're suitable to receive a kidney transplant. And that is also true for our liver recipients. So there's something for both groups of people in this strategy. But this is a real result, and it is something that I feel absolutely delighted about. So what are we going to do, next slide, with our scheme within this strategy? So we're going to maximise transplant opportunities in the way that we know we can do it best using this scheme, but not forget that some patients will still need to have access to those antibody removal techniques as well, because they may not get a match, however hard we try in this scheme. Next slide, please. So the next strategy will allow us to continue to innovate. It will continue to build capacity to maximise this scheme. We are already starting a digital transformation programme to underpin the scheme and all activities related to living donation. And it's allowing us, as we've already done, to explore options for collaborating with our international colleagues, so that if we can find you an opportunity for a transplant in another country, if we haven't got one here in the UK, that might also be possible. Next slide, please. So the next revolution, next slide, please. The next revolution, I was going to say, and sorry, it's when you're not driving your own slide. The next revolution really is about doing all of that and making this scheme as best as it can be for all of you. So in summary, the kidney sharing scheme has revolutionised our approach to living donor kidney transplantation, and definitely antibody incompatible transplantation, and therefore the successful outcomes of transplants for our patients. We know that it's the largest scheme in Europe, and we're very proud of that, but we are actually not so proud that we recognise it still continues to need to evolve and improve. And we need to do that so that we make the most of absolutely every transplant opportunity. So it's a continuous improvement programme. I'm delighted to be leading on that within NHSBT. I have a fabulous team of people who work from all their different disciplines, as well as yourselves who tell us what you want out of the scheme. And we have lots more work to do, and we look forward to doing that. Next slide, please. So just to acknowledge all my colleagues, really, I can't name them on one slide. So all my colleagues from all these different places who contribute to this work. And I think that's all from me, but my last slide will just encourage you to ask questions in the last 2 minutes of time that I have available to you. Thank you.
Lisa, thank you very much. What a fascinating talk that was. We've been inundated with questions, and one of the questions was, could we have a copy of this presentation and notes so we can cascade it to the KPA? Now, what we're going to do is we're going to have a watch again on the website, and every question that's been asked, even if we don't answer it live today, we're going to go to the person who's doing the presentation, get them to answer it, and then we'll go back to you. So everything will be able to be seen again and answered. We've also got here that Michael said, is there an age limit for recipients or donors to enter the scheme?
No. There's no age limit. There's no upper age limit. Our oldest non-directed donor was 85, and I followed him around the country as he had he went viral on media, and he was saying I was mowing my lawn in a week, which wasn't entirely realistic, but no, there's really no age limit. It's all done on clinical assessment and suitability to be in the scheme. No age limit.
Brilliant. If you're on the transplant waiting list, are you automatically on the live transplant scheme?
No. In order to be in the scheme, if you're a transplant recipient, to go into the paired pool scheme, you need a willing donor to go in with you. But you may benefit at the end of a chain if you're on the transplant waiting list. So you may benefit from the transplant even if you don't have a living donor, but no, you're not automatically in that scheme. But if you're interested in it, it's something to discuss with your medical team. Really important.
And someone's just put, what a wonderful scheme. My husband was on it, had a transplant, and his life has been transformed. And thank you very much. That's what they've just put. So
my pleasure. Our pleasure, actually. Everybody, this is dear to everybody's heart, and we love what's happened to it, and we didn't foresee it. So if it's making a difference to people's lives, that's all we want.
sadly, Lisa, we're out of time, but fantastic talk. And we've had so many questions, and we'll forward them all on to you.